Now let's see how to accomplish some of these same tasks in Visual Studio Code. In this demo, you'll see how to inspect data in the Variables window, which is similar to the Locals window in Visual Studio. We'll add variables to the Watch window, store variables that have gone out of scope, similar to the Make Object ID functionality in Visual Studio that you saw. And then we'll modify input values right in the debugger. Let's start by opening Visual Studio Code. You can navigate to the folder where you stored the web application for this module. Since I've already opened that folder, I have a shortcut here. When it opens, I'll expand the folder and open the Pages and Expenses folders. Now I can edit the code behind for the index page and the reports page. Let's run the application. But before I can do that, I need to generate the build and debug assets, which is a new folder in the project folder behind the scenes. Now this is the same code that was created in Visual Studio, so it's using the SQL Server Express local DB instance that Visual Studio installs, and the config file still points to that. I haven't done anything different for VS Code. But if you only have VS Code installed, you'll need to download and install SQL Server Express, or configure the solution to use a different backend database. Let's run this. And when the app opens, navigate to the Expenses page, and let's update the dates of the search, so we can just get the expenses for the last few days of February. Before I run this, I just want to create a breakpoint on the index page. Okay, now let's filter the search. I'll go back to VS Code, and we're stopped at the breakpoint and in debug mode. The Variables window on the left shows a Locals subfolder, and the top-level variable is this, just like the Locals window in Visual Studio, this being the class of the code behind page. If I expand this, there are the same variables we saw in Visual Studio, the variables created in code, like amount total and the expenses list object, as well as ASP.NET data that's inherited from the parent page model object. Here's the start and end dates for the search that were entered in the view. If I hit F10 to populate the expenses variable from the repository, this collapses in the locals. But if I expand it, you can see the collection was populated. I can right-click this collection and add to watch. Now it gets added to the watch window. You can also add variables and expressions to the watch window manually. I'll type in the amount total variable. Now rather than step through this loop, I'll right-click farther down and run to cursor. Now amount total has been populated in the watch window. Now when we navigate away from this page, say to the reports page, the value of expenses in the watch window here will get overwritten by the collection with the same name on the reports page. And if we right-click on the expenses variable, we don't have an option to make object ID for this collection like we did in Visual Studio. But using the debug console, we can create a new variable that's a copy of the expenses variable. I'll call it search page expenses, and don't forget to add the semicolon at the end. Now that variable shows in the Locals window at the top. It has the collection of expenses. And if I right-click on here, I can add this to the watch window. Okay, now let's continue running the code. Let's open the reports page code behind, and let's set a breakpoint here where the report is generated. Now let's open the reports page in the running application, and let's run the report for February. I'll step through up to the point where the expenses collection gets populated. Notice in the watch window that this.expenses is null because it's now referencing the expenses collection on the reports page, which is the variable that's in scope now. But the search page expenses collection in the watch window still shows a count of 5 because this is a copy of the expenses from the other page. Now let's try and modify the date value of the start date variable. I'll double-click on it in the Variables window and try to change the date. So same issue as in Visual Studio. So let's try entering an expression here to create a new date time with the day starting on the 25th. And that works, just like in Visual Studio. If I hover over the start date variable in the code, you can see that it's been updated. I'll hit F10 to advance the code. And now there are 2 expenses in the collection. And the expenses collection from the other page still shows the 5 expenses that were retrieved for the same date range. We can expand each expense object and view its properties. But unlike Visual Studio, we can't pin any of these properties to the parent list view to make it easier to compare the values. There is a way we can do this by modifying the code though, and you'll be seeing that later in the course in the module on coding for debugging. In this module, you learned about some of the traps you can fall into if you don't have an effective approach for debugging. Then we looked at an approach that you can use for debugging based on the scientific method. And as a reference for this approach, you can check out the book Code Complete, 2nd edition, from Microsoft Press. Steve McConnell is the author. It was published in 2004, but the concepts are just as relevant today. Next in this module, we did some demos to illustrate debugging data using the tools in Visual Studio. You saw a calculation error and how to stabilize the error to make it repeatable. Then we inspected data in the debugger using debugging windows in Visual Studio. Next, you saw how to modify inputs right in Visual Studio while debugging. When we found the source of the defect, we fixed it and looked for similar errors in the code. And finally, you saw how Visual Studio Code allows you to do many of the same tasks as Visual Studio when it comes to inspecting and debugging data. In the next module, we're going to talk more about breakpoints and tracing data using code from the system.diagnostics namespace in .NET.